Welcome to the show, George. It's honestly quite a pleasure and honor to have you here today.
Oh, thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
I've been following your work for quite some time, and your work really deals in boys and men's health advocacy from this left-leaning perspective, which is
Mm.
almost like an oxymoron in of itself sometimes.
Yeah.
But I am curious on like what led you to this endeavor starting off.
Obviously, I get asked that a lot. Like, why are you doing this?
Hmm.
And I'm just like, I think the question should be, why are you not doing it? Like, why are so many on the left not exactly where I am right now? Like, if we're going to say that being left wing is about, in part, social equality, and advocacy for sort of people that need help, why are we not talking about homeless men or drug addicted men or men who are locked up, incarcerated, or why are we not talking about sentencing bias, or why are we not talking about the mutilation of boys' genitals? Why are we not talking about why are the left not talking about the fact boys are behind at every stage of education, or the fact that men are more likely to die at every age group and live shorter lives in every single country? I don't. I always have to explain why I'm doing this when I think it's perfectly obvious that it's important. And these are left-wing issues that the left have decided to neglect or abandon, betray, because they're not popular. And I don't really care about what's popular. I just want to help the most amount of people. And unfortunately, men and boys advocacy is very unpopular in the left. And I don't understand why. So I don't know. I haven't really got an answer for you
Hmm.
other than I think it's important. Like the biggest cause of the biggest risk to my life and your life is suicide. So that's a good enough reason, I think. So let's go with that.
And when you, I'm sure, talk about this in certain circles, there's probably a wince or a cringe with people. I know there is
Yeah,
with
well,
me
eye
when
rolls and
I,
scoffing and
yeah, the scoffing is always good. They act like you can't
yeah,
see it. Like,
yeah,
yeah, I see you sneering right now. But
yeah.
I am curious, like, why is there such like a reluctance to it? So it's not even like, oh, I wasn't sure that this exists. Like, it's not so much a doubtfulness, but so much even like uh like jeering at the fact that this exists. Like, sure.
Well, I think we seem to think men are advantaged in every single possible way. Every single man is advantaged in every single possible way, and that's as detailed as a picture which we're going to paint when it comes to gender equality. When of course that's not true. There certainly are advantages to being a man, but there are also disadvantages too. And the left are just not willing to talk about that. Um, and I think we should. So I'm going to ask you the question again. What was the question?
It was the reluctance to like even
Right. Oh,
acknowledging
right,
the
right.
issue
And then like
because
this concept of men being advantaged in every single possible way is very much brought into the identity of being left wing, especially being a feminist, where you're brought hook, line, and sinker into this worldview of like the patriarchy, for example, or male privilege. And when you see discussions like mine or information like what I present, often that goes against your perception of the world, and it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing because you spent a whole life buying into that narrative that is actually not necessarily correct. You've built your friends around it. You might have a job that's dependent on it, your whole community and way of life. You might even have a t-shirt. And I was like, once you've lived that lifestyle for so long, very people are very reluctant to change. If people are all about like women's rights, women's safety, and I say, well, actually, men are even more at risk to violent crime, statistically speaking. People don't like that, although it is true, because all their whole life has been about the opposite. And people like to think that they're the hero of their own story, and often they're not. Often they're wrong, and people don't want to be wrong, especially about things that's so important to society. But I think it's
hmm
mainly down to people building these ideas into their identity, identifying as their political ideas, which means you can't really change them.
When I first heard of you, it was on the Modern Wisdom podcast, which is a great podcast, and everyone listening should check
Yeah.
it out. But when I was listening to the episode, you were starting off and kind of gave this disclaimer where you mentioned that women's
Yeah.
issues do matter, girls' issues do matter. I feel the same, compulsion to say something similar to give that disclaimer, but that's not the root cause of the disclaimer. The root cause is that people interpret this issue as a zero sum game.
Mm,
That if
mm,
you're talking about men's issues, then you're obviously neglecting and ignoring, don't care about girls and women's issues. And if you're talking about, and that's kind of how a lot of this is looked at when I feel like that's how it's at least interpreted. I was wondering if you still kind of feel that or what your thoughts on are that.
I feel like that's just like a red herring that people throw at you often, that talking about men and boys means you can't possibly care about women and girls. Whereas, of course, that isn't true. And I do care about women and girls, and I do care about women's issues. And I do have many women in my life that are important to me. And the stories they tell me about what they go through is heartbreaking. But that doesn't mean men and boys don't have their own experiences that need to be listened to, and like both things can be and are true at the same time. And like you said, I really hate having this conversation because it just
Hmm.
makes me seem like I don't know, guilty by default, and I'll just continually have to prove myself and virtue signal and show my credentials and
Hmm.
kiss the ring, bow down, pay penance. And I don't think we need to apologize for talking about men and boys in this way. And I'm not going to apologize for it. And I don't feel like I need to prove myself because I just feel like it's self-evident that men are human beings and they deserve compassion too. And so do women, of course. And yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult trick. A lot of people play that to make themselves look morally virtuous and you to be sort of like a
Hmm.
misogynist. But it's just a sort of a trick, a semantic trick that people play that undermines your point before you've even started.
Understood.
Hmm.
When you see 1 in 4 fathers don't live, when 1 in 4 fathers don't live with their children, excuse me, and less than 1 in every 4 teachers are men, and a mere 5% of psychologists under the age of 30 are male,
Mm.
how do you believe some of these consequences manifest themselves?
Well, what you're talking about there is a lack of male role models in the lives of boys. So you're right. About one quarter of boys in America living without a father. About 80% of teachers are women, and the vast majority of clinical psychologists and therapists are women as well. Uh, and that I guess that leaves a massive dearth of sort of positive male role models and leadership, and a lot of boys who are not being socialized, especially at home. Like if you think about 1 in 4 boys in America have no father, they go to work, they go to school. 80% of them have no male teacher either. So there's no primary male role model for about 1 in 5 boys in America. And the results are they go looking for belonging elsewhere. So a lot of them they'll go and they'll join a gang or be recruited by a gang, or they'll go online and they'll be sort of drafted into like the whole Andrew Tate army of other misogynists that just clearly don't like women, and they're basically corrupted and adopted and taken advantage of, exploited because they can't find that sense of meaning and belonging elsewhere or leadership from a man, and they're sort of very they're ripe to be exploited, but in the
Mm,
way I described. And that's personally why I think these online spaces and online so-called influences, misogyny influencers, that's why they're so popular because they represent a massive lack of massive lack of positive male role models, and how, in my opinion, people on the left, especially, have betrayed men and boys and left them behind and like shouted them down and shamed them, called them names, and just blamed everything on them for so long that they're
hmm.
like, well, I'm checking out, I'm checking out, and I'm like, I get it, I've checked out as well, but I haven't checked into the Andrew Tate style. I still hate him, but I recognize why he exists and why people follow him.
Well, if you just look at the messaging too, I read like a Substack article on this, and it was kind of
Mm,
comparing some of his messaging that, if he's saying this isn't the exhaustive list of it, but if he's mentioning his messaging in his podcast that boys and men should be fit and capable at
mm,
some point. And then you also have major news outlets that being fit and capable is part of being on the far right, and you may be this extremist. Like what message do you think is going to land with the male audience? It's the same thing with the word toxic masculinity, for example, where someone
mm,
such as Tate will, disavow that or push back on that. And this isn't defensive of him, but it's more or less why like popularity can rise in this vacuum. But if you
mm,
push back on that, Tate is, and then you have people on the left and others pushing, leaning into that term. And the Center for Male Psychology found that 85% of men believe that term is actually harmful to boys.
Mm.
It's like you're not even listening to the men that and boys you're supposed to be helping from people on the
Yeah.
left. You're just like force feeding this term that no one appears to like, but is so often deployed in conversation and in these spaces.
That it's also worth adding to that poll you mentioned from the Centre of Male Psychology that
Hmm.
found, I think it's about 88% of men polled found that term insulting and unhelpful and
Hmm.
damaging to boys, especially, but also women. Very similar amount of women felt the same. It's not just men that hate it.
Oh,
Women hate
interesting.
it. Women hate it too. Like we all hate it. No
Huh.
one, no other demographic group would we accept assigning the term toxic. Like it would. I don't even want to give examples because it's so offensive
Hmm.
and stupid. But I don't understand why we can call masculinity toxic, and yet no other demographic group can be called toxic. Because like, are we not? Can we not afford the same respect and compassion, dignity to men as we give to everyone else? And yeah, I hate the term toxic masculinity. I feel like it pathologizes an innate part of men. I don't think masculinity is toxic. I think there are certainly toxic attitudes towards masculinity that hurt men and boys in the same way as they hurt women and girls, but masculinity in itself isn't toxic. And it's like it's a shame because we should have learned this lesson before because about 100 years ago there's this concept called female hysteria where women's distress was pathologized as something wrong in her and she was called hysterical, so female
Hmm.
hysteria, and it was seen as like a medical problem to be treated. And now I feel like toxic masculinity is just a modern equivalent of female hysteria, and it's being followed by and apparently treated by the same corrective therapies. And it's like we've not learned, and we should stop pathologizing masculinity and stop pretending like men have something wrong inside of them because they don't.
That's a great comparison.
Mm,
Absolutely fantastic comparison because it puts it in this unfair light where you're on the backbone. I mean, I
mm,
heard this from like Douglas Murray before in like a recent book of his, but it's like it's so much easier to burn down a house than it is to build it. And it's just easy to take certain aspects that certain men exhibit and be like, oh, that represents this thing called toxic masculinity. I'm sure it's the same thing to do on the other side as well, but both are equally as unhelpful as the other, and
mm.
kind of making any progress that your, vision or your mission may claim to want to do or achieve.
It doesn't identify any
Hmm.
actual tangible symptoms that can be treated. Like male depression, for example, is a useful term because that's something that we know what it is. We can discuss it in quite detail and we can get it treated. Toxic masculinity, I don't know what you're talking about. Everyone has their own definition. And that's why we have this strange phenomenon where everything seems to be being blamed on toxic masculinity. So like gang culture, knife crime, Donald Trump's election, all toxic masculinity. But then again, so are climate change, not recycling, Brexit, the climate crisis, the
Hmm.
financial crash of 2008. I've seen things like meat eating, women not having pockets. They're all caused by toxic masculinity. And I'm like, I don't understand how something that causes gang violence can also cause men not recycling. I don't get that. And that's because the
Hmm.
concept itself has no meaning. It's completely vague. And like studies that have examined toxic masculinity, they've looked at studies that use that term, and they found out about half of studies that talk about toxic masculinity don't even define what it is. So it's like I don't. It doesn't mean anything to me. It just, in my opinion, it just basically tries to attach men to bad things. Tries to make does men look bad by association. Like this is men, this is men, this is men, and
Hmm.
that's what it's trying to do. And in that way, it's very effective. But it's
There,
just trying to associate men with bad things.
yeah. When you were also on that Modern Wisdom podcast, another point that I absolutely loved that you made was when speaking to these men's health issues and use prison rates, for example, and men being sentenced at higher rates or longer sentences, convicted
Mm,
for longer sentences than women. And you generally speak, or not generally speaking, just on average, and you see uh this kind of pushback. Well, men did something. Like obviously this is like a man's issue, and all for individual agency and accountability. But you mentioned that this never is brought to when it comes to things like race. Like if you've heard
Yeah,
like violent
yeah, yeah, yeah,
crime in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods and say is majority black neighborhood and community, you don't hear, well, it's black people killing each other,
yeah,
so why should we care? Why should we?
yeah,
And I would never advocate nor suggest that. But when it comes to men, it's like the forefront of mind. It's like, well, men, it's the one men's are doing. It's a man's problem, obviously. And it's not to say that it's not a man's problem, but it's more to say that it's not just something that men should like care about, or it's not just something that is you can just dismiss it with that easy kind of like, well, men are the people who are doing this, so who cares?
yeah. I mean, that's a very, yeah, a very effective sort of way of looking at these double standards. That people say, you know, men commit most violent crimes, which they do, and that's chalked up to toxic masculinity. But then if you look at that in more detail, and you look at the fact that it's actually black men that are even more likely to commit violent crimes, like you wouldn't assign toxic to the color of their skin, would you? And like that again, that's an example of just how offensive it would be if it was assigned to any other demographic by the same logic, the exact same logic. And then saying like when we talk about violent crime and men, how they're victims of violence, it's always like you said, who's doing it? Men. And I'm like, okay, well that's true, but what's your point? Again, that's the same bigotry that racists use to wave away black on black crime, is what that was called. Well, it's black men stabbing other black men, so therefore it doesn't matter. That's what the racists used to say, and still do say. But that's what we're saying now to just men. Like we don't care about violence against men because it's by other men and therefore is utterly meaningless. Um, and yeah, you mentioned how like in America and the UK, a man and a woman going to court will not get a fair trial, not get equally fair trial. Like a man is more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime and more likely to get a long sentence if he is. Same in England. In England, UK Ministry of Justice says a man is 88% more likely to go to prison for the same crime under similar criminal circumstances, quote, as a woman. And that's just I don't understand how that's acceptable. It's not acceptable. And it's again, it happens with black communities. So in America, black communities are about 10 to 20% more, get 10 to 20% longer sentences for the same crime as white communities because of the racist sentencing bias. But men are 6 times more likely. So they get 60% more sentence than a woman. So there's a sentencing bias experienced by black people. The one experienced by men is significantly larger, like 3 to 6 times larger, and we don't talk about it. And obviously, black men pay the price twice because they're both male and black. So they'll pay 63% plus that was obviously compounded by 10 to 20% on top of that. So it's interesting. There's an interesting parallel between some of the issues that black communities experience and then also ones that men experience and how they're doubly impacting black men. And again, no one wants to talk about that style of intersectionality is not very popular, but I think really, really, really important.
Mm. Yeah, speaking of like intersectionality and like toxic masculinity, both terms that come from left-wing academia. I was hearing like
Mm.
Richard Reeves and speak to like toxic masculinity and the origins of that. But
Well,
if
originally
I
it's from the My Poetic movement.
mm,
The my
mm,
originally it was a men's. It was an issue. It was a toxic masculinity was originally a term developed, coined by the My Poetic Men's movement. But you are right; it's now been sort of adopted into a more
mhm.
feminist left wing space.
Well, the way that I was understanding it too was that it was like prior to Trump's election. It was used in very small spaces in
Mm.
academia to describe very specific behaviors in men's
Mm.
prisons and all men's prisons, obviously, to describe how hyper masculinity can really become toxic and dangerous and be harmful and obviously lethal, I'm sure, to an extent. And then
Mm.
post Trump's election and post Me Too movement, a few things changed, and then it became, the gates burst open, and now it was used by the mainstream media and then everyone else. But it's just interesting to me that like these terms maybe came from or adopted by the left, but they're like skewed in how they like approach it. So it's not
Mm.
a whole a holistic viewpoint. It's very skewed to, I think, in my opinion, achieve a very a very specific aim or agenda rather than. And I think it's also like hijack the word social justice as well, something that does mean
Yeah.
something, but the word that once again hijacked my opinion to a large extent to achieve a very specific aim, and it may not be say just at all, or the means to get there may not be just at all. So it's
Mm.
interesting for sure. And there's a number of thoughts I want to get on family courts too, because what you provide and why it's so helpful and valuable is just simply knowledge and awareness. It's not as if you're saying like, hey, you need to like put me from your face and listen to all this. You're like, hey, like this matters and this is how it matters. And I think a lot of men maybe feel these things or see
Mm.
these things. I know I did, but I couldn't like synthesize it. Like I couldn't like find the data for it, or I didn't even look for it to be honest. And you're someone who like puts it there, like, hey, this is what's like happening. So it's not just you, or it's not just you being like gaslit or like not being paid attention to, stuff like that. So that's why I think it's so
Yeah.
helpful. And
I,
mhm,
well, I try to keep my, yeah, thank you. I try to keep my subjective opinion out of, I mean, obviously I do give my opinion as well sometimes, but most of all, like you said, I'm just holding up a mirror to society. I'm like, here's the data on domestic violence, and here's the latest research on sexual abuse, and here's some numbers about homelessness and addiction, suicide. I'm just showing you the data a lot of the time, and that's all I need to do. I don't need to dress it up in some sort of political jargon. I just need to show you what's going on and why it matters. And yeah, I try not to get too bogged down in the ideological rhetoric like other
mhm.
people do. And I just don't think I need to, because the numbers are so compelling and distressing. I just try to show them to you. And yeah, I hold up a mirror. And if you don't like what's looking back, that's not my problem. That's the reality. And a lot of people don't like the reality of what I show them, despite it being true.
And can you speak to that reality in family courts and how that looks for men, because it plays into another important issue as well.
Well, the reality in family courts in America is that in 45 of the 50 states, you are not given equal rights to the mother. So you go, what people are asking for is something called the presumption of joint custody, where both parents go into family court to fight for their child, and the court, as described, has a presumption of shared custody. So their starting point is this child's going to have shared custody for both parents, and then both parents build their case top of that. So they'll be like, time, how much time and money do they have? Can they support a child? Is there a history of abuse? All those things are then taken into account on top of that presumption. And from there, both parents or one parent gets custody. That's how it works. But that only exists in 5 states. The other 45 states, the mum is seen as the natural guardian, and she walks to that family court, and the father walks in. She's got an innate advantage because of her gender, and she's seen as the more favored parent in 45 states. That is slowly changing. It's very similar in the UK, but slowly more and more states are adopting this presumption of shared child custody, because ultimately that is what a child needs. A child, forget about what the parents have rights to. The child has a right to both his or her parents, and that's what presumption of shared custody laws are trying to do. So, again, in the same way that men are disadvantaged in criminal court, in the way I described earlier, they're also disadvantaged in family court. And again, that's just an example of systemic sexism, structural sexism that hurts men, and that people don't want to talk about that. People don't think men can experience structural sexism, but I've outlined some great examples of structural, institutional sexism. Family courts is one of the very worst and most heartbreaking from what I've seen.
hmm I can only imagine that. And
Mm,
I said it like ties into another issue, which is men's suicide, because there's this confusion that suicide is simply and ultimately explained by mental illness and depression.
mm,
But I mean, I saw you mention this as well, that in the research that you reviewed, suicide is this rational based solution to various issues that individual men are facing, but maybe very similar, such as the loss
mm.
of child custody, bankruptcy, loss of a job. And yeah, I was curious on if you could speak into that for both the UK and the US. Because there are a lot of
Yeah, well,
parallels.
no, you're very right. Suicide obviously is the biggest risk to life for all young men in America and the UK and mostly across the entire world, to be honest. The leading cause of death in young men. Often it is being discussed, not enough, but it's being discussed more mostly, almost if not entirely, within the context of male suicide being a mental health problem, and obviously it is impacted by mental health, but primarily it's not a mental health problem. Primarily, suicide is caused by sort of structural reasons, structural causes, like I described, that are placing stress onto men, and they see suicide as a rational decision, solution-based decision to solving the problem. So the problem of maybe they've lost their job, they're going to debt, they can't pay their mortgage, maybe they're losing their child in family court, maybe their relationship's broken down, maybe they're addicted to drugs, maybe they've got a disability. The whole disability thing plays into the work. A lot of men fall out of work because they're disabled and then die by suicide. A lot of men are being abused and they use suicide as a way of getting out of that. A lot of men are dealing with sexual assault in childhood, especially. These are all things that are causing men to take their lives. It's moderated by mental health, but primarily it's not a mental health problem. Like the majority of men who are suicidal that have been studied don't conceptualize the problem they have as a mental health problem. Um, and that's where I think we're getting it wrong. Like a man who's losing his child in family court in the way we described, there are certainly going to be mental health problems that come out of that. But the issue itself is not a mental health problem. That's a legal problem, a structural problem that no amount of mental health support for that man will ever solve. That no amount of him talking or crying will solve the problem of family courts in America. That change comes through societal, political change, and advocacy. And that's where I get frustrated with male suicide advocacy because it doesn't go any deeper. It just tells men to talk and then fails to talk itself about the things that men are telling them. The issues that are shaping men's stress never talked about or listened to. And that's why I don't think men talking is good enough. And I wish we had a bit looked at the problem with a bit more detail and worked out what are they telling us and actually listened to what men are talking about rather than just endlessly saying men can talk, men can talk, men can talk. So yeah, that's what I'd say about male suicide. Very complicated issue.
And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was a study that looked at men who attempted suicide, but failed suicide attempts, as I believe they're called.
Mm.
And 80% of those men believe that they would not classify themselves as mentally ill.
So that's interesting. What you're talking about is a
Yeah.
set of studies. One study found that 91% of men who had completed suicide, so men that had died by suicide that were middle-aged in the UK, 91% of those men had sought help. So they were seeking help from mental health system. Some of them in the week prior to their suicide. I think like 1 in 3 were in therapy the prior week, and they still died by suicide. So more than 9 in 10 men who died by suicide sought help and still killed themselves. And of those men that had been seen by a clinician, 80% of them was deemed no risk or low risk. So they are seeking help, and their risk factors are just not being picked up. So 80% of men who die by suicide were seen as no risk or low risk by a clinician. So clearly something is not right in the way that we're analyzing or the way the psychological industry works for men in general. That goes back to your first question about 80%, 85% sometimes of clinical psychologists are women. That obviously creates a space in a field that is more geared towards women's needs and women's unique style of disclosing distress. And I feel like I'm not saying that's intentionally done. That's just a natural bias that comes out of any industry where it's dominated by a particular group. And that's why I feel like we need more male psychologists to look into the unique ways in which distress presents itself in men, and then also more broadly confronting the issue of male suicide from a way that's a bit more male friendly and a bit more male centric. Uh, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's so much to say about suicide. The thing about suicide is like if the more and more you speak to loved ones who have lost men to suicide, the more you realize that they have no idea why the men they love took their life. And that is like what's so tragic about suicide. They leave a family behind that has no idea why they did it. And yet people online claim to have all the answers for all men, and it's toxic masculinity that's doing it. And I just want to be like, if the people in that man's life who are closest to them, wives, parents, children, have no idea, then who are you to claim that you know? Because that's how suicide works. It's very idiosyncratic and it's very individual and there's no simple answers and there is no one answer. So I mean, I want to underline everything I'm saying of that. Like I don't know. I would never
Hmm.
know unless I sat down with that man maybe and asked him, but that's not something we can do.
And the
So
underscore, hmm
go
and
on,
just
it's complicated.
yeah, and just to underscore one thing that you mentioned too is how a man may disclose that, say, suicidal ideation or leaning into those suicidal
Mm,
thoughts is it's different. It's subtle. It could be a remark when one is
mm.
drunk, which obviously, you're not
Well,
looking for, but like yeah, a stupid joke,
yeah, matter of
something.
fact. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Very plain way. Men often disclose suicide in a very matter of fact, plain way, in like a jokey way, where they're not actually joking, and people again misinterpret that communication of distress. And again, that's just we don't. Same with like men like self harm, for example. Our view of self harm is very much around how women self harm, like a lot of like cutting, for example. But men self harm in different ways. Like punching a wall, for example, is seen as how men self harm, but again, that's interpreted differently. That's interpreted as like a sign of aggression or show of power or dominance or terrorizing like a woman. But often that is also a sign of self-harm. And I just think we're not classifying men in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a detailed, in-depth issue that's rather individualized, but is looked at as you can set this industry standard to solve it,
Mm,
such as just
mm,
talking. And
mm.
I
Yeah.
find that so patronizing.
Yeah.
It's
And
just
also, it's just like, I mean, I don't know if you ever read the book Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus, but that talks a lot about how men and women communicate. And men more often, when they talk about their problems, they want a solution. Women more often want to talk about it and be heard and
hmm
validated. Both have their merits. And I mean, I go between the two. But in general, men want solutions to their problems, which is why you have that classic argument between, the hypothetical girlfriend and boyfriend, and she just wants to be heard, and he's giving her solutions,
hmm
and she's like, "You're not listening to what I'm saying," and he's like, "You're not listening to what I'm saying," and then, you have the sort of sitcom-based argument. But that's how it works, and a lot of men don't want to go into a therapy room in like a clinical environment and sit down with what's usually a woman and tell her his problems. They want to feel a bit more productive, a bit more active. They want to help solve the problem. They want to speak to a man a lot of the time. And that's where you arrive at a different type of therapy. So the
yeah,
emergence of like side by side time, they call it. So women like face to face time, like what we're having right now with their girlfriends. But men prefer, in general, side by side time. So time spent alongside their male friends doing things, going on hikes, walks, playing games, bushcraft groups, and, men's sheds and just men's groups in general. Like group therapy is a bit more, from what I've seen, a bit more uh, beneficial to men. I think men benefit more from that sort of therapy rather than the one-to-one, face-to-face clinical
hmm
environment. But we're speaking generalizations, of course. Like
hmm
obviously, it goes both ways.
for sure. Yeah, I actually have a friend who's in grad school to become a psychologist, and he's a guy. I'm just very happy for him because the space is
Mm,
so, as you mentioned, so ill-fitted, I would say. I never went to therapy, so I can't like, but so ill-fitted, I could confidently say in terms of the number of men who were,
mm,
you know, in it or rising to it. Same thing with like teachers. I have a couple friends who are teachers who are guys, and just happy to see them in it because not only are there like not a lot of men who are teachers, a lot of men, almost 50% drop out of being a teacher within 5 years of starting. So
mm.
it's not something that has
And
a good,
this hasn't been it's not a particularly friendly place to men teaching, unfortunately. A lot of people are very suspicious of men
mm,
around kids in general, and I can see why a lot of men wouldn't want to be a teacher because you're just permanently in that space. But we need more men in teaching, especially for boys. I mentioned earlier how boys are behind at every stage of education in the West, and they are more or less. And one of the big causes of that is how girls, a bit like in how men in courtrooms, but girls in classrooms are marked higher for the same work. So in courtrooms, talked about how men are punished more harshly for the same crime, but in school of girls, girls are marked higher for the same work, because again, we have women teachers, mostly women teachers, and
yeah,
there's a bias, grading bias, like the sentencing bias, but there is a grading bias. And again, studies have found that male teachers are less likely to problematize boys' bad behavior more likely to see what they are actually doing, which is normally acting up. A lot of boys in school are not necessarily naughty, they're just bored or disengaged or not interested. And I feel like more male teachers are more able to recognize that.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points there. One of which, with like as you said, they don't label a boy's behaviors problematic and kind of completely escalate the situation. Sometimes it may
Mm,
require that, but it's also you see between boys and girls is boys have less impulse control when growing up, and girls, they reach puberty earlier. Their cortex develops earlier with which helps them make more analytical decisions, such as doing your homework, turning that in, applying to colleges, getting your extracurricular activities, all that stuff. Whereas
mm.
boys don't have that, or they do, it just develops on a slower basis. And to that second point you said with the on pretty much discrimination in terms of grading, that there was a recently published study that the Big Think highlighted on their site, that they looked at 39,000 Italian 10th graders and found that for
Oh yeah.
male and female students who have identical subject specific competence, teachers gave higher grades to girls. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I always thought that in grade school, I was probably wrong, to be honest. I was probably just not doing the work for me individually, but maybe not. But it's just something that when you see the data, like it makes sense, but it's just such a reluctance to even at that point to be like, oh, well, this could be an issue. This is a concern. We probably should flag this.
Uh, I mean, I don't think we ever can do that. I mean, this isn't a new issue. The boys behind at school has been an issue for as long as I've been alive, so more than 30 years now. And no one's really addressed it or talked about it with any sort of like actual commitment or meaning. So I don't know if it when it's going to change or if it will change at all. But I've read that study, the Italian one too, and it's very interesting. Like we had a real life uh, test of grading bias over lockdown. So in the UK, all exams were cancelled because of lockdown. Schools are closed, no exams, and children's grades are based on teacher assessments only. So we're taking away an objective measure of children's intelligence, a test, and we're replacing it with a subjective measure of a child's intelligence through teacher assessment. And it's a really great way of showing the bias towards girls because girls went further ahead than they were before. Boys and grades actually improved, but not as much as girls. So it shows that uh, the more we base a child's grades on subjective teacher assessment, the more that benefits girls. And the more we talk about objective measures of intelligence like testing, the more that
Hmm.
gives a equal benefit to both boys and girls. So it's interesting. There's so much data around it. So many people, so many leading authorities speaking about systemic bias against boys, to quote Mary Koenig Cook. It's amazing how we don't talk about it. It's amazing. We talk about all the other gaps in education, like rich and poor, black and white, city, non-city, different generations. And those are gaps that we may not like, but we can actually work to understand. We can understand why rich kids do better than poor kids. But for girls and boys, these are kids going to the same school from the same families with the same socio-economic backgrounds, and the girls are doing better. So it's sort of a gap we can't even explain. So I don't know. I've not seen any well-meaning attempt to understand it, apart from a few philanthropists and generous individuals that want to talk about it. But
Hmm.
nothing governmental, nothing funded. In America, they have the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, which is about getting women and girls into education. That coalition does not exist for men and boys. So there is no national coalition for men and boys in education, and no one's asking for one. So it is demoralizing, and that's why we need to speed up and actually start talking about it and get over this whole thing about men and boys can't experience sexism because they clearly can. And that's what we've been talking about for the past half hour. Some great examples.
Yeah.
And I was like, we're talking about kids now. Like if anyone deserves change, it's surely children.
Hmm.
And we're hurting boys by being not having the guts to talk about these issues properly.
Sure. And just speaking of advocacy, Richard Reeves, like who is the author of Boys and Men, the president of the
Mm.
American Institute for Boys and Men. What do you think of Reeves and his work thus far in advocacy, and I just wonder if like how much inspiration you've pulled from him, or how much you have like kept up with his individual work.
I like Richard Reeves. Yeah, I mean, I've read his book, one of the only books I've read twice. I bought his book for friends. I've read it myself. I've got the audiobook. I've got the physical. I enjoy his blogs. I listen to his podcasts. I I'm 100% confident that, in my opinion, he's a net contributor to this area of advocacy. He does a lot of good, and he's very smart and kind and has a good heart. And he gives it credibility. Like he's a very credible scholar and academic himself, and he's got a lot of experience working politics, and we need him. We need more people like him. But I don't know if he's necessarily an expert in communication. I don't think he's particularly. I think he has a style of discourse that I've been thinking about calling as Reevesism, which is just what we talked about earlier, where this overly apologetic sort of hand wringing and complete apology at like just constantly wanting to apologize for what he's about to say, constantly having to say, I care about women and girls too, and sort of this sense of shame he brings into discourse, I don't appreciate. I think a lot of the things he says, he undermines what he's going to say before he's even said it. He'll say like, "Well, I'm going to talk about men and boys now. That doesn't mean I don't care about women and girls. It doesn't make me misogynist. Two things can exist at the same time. Of course, women and girls. I'm like, get on with it. Just get on with it,
Hmm.
Richard. Stop like cowering down and kissing the ring and like just literally praying to the gods." And I'm like, you're not. There's nothing to be sorry about, and you don't need to apologize. So just get on with what you've got to say, because what you're saying is actually really important. So like I said, I'll end with how I started. Richard Reeves is excellent, excellent man, very smart, kind, but not perfect. And I mean, I love talking to him about it because it's something I keep seeing him doing, and
Hmm.
I don't think I don't think he's doing himself any favors. I think he's losing a lot of support from the men in this space because they're like, you're just selling us down a river.
Mm.
And but I'm interested to see what he does next with the AIMB. And
And
I mean,
mhm.
good for him. Good for him to actually do something.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think I almost share that compulsion to put those disclaimers out myself. But when I first listened to you, as I said, I'm like, wait, why? Like, why am I keep doing this? This is silly. This is a
Yeah.
name because the people you're not trying to offend don't care. They're gonna be offended either way.
Mm,
Not like, oh, we put the disclaimer out there. Obviously, all is well. I'm gonna take his words and information at face value now. And the people who are looking for help and are looking for you to be their voice and to share their thoughts and what they're going through, they're like, what are you doing? Apologizing
mm,
for
mm.
what you're about to say. Like
Mm.
this matters. Like stop, as you said, sell me down the river.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's just like stop making this something to be ashamed of. It's
Mm-hmm.
like I remember when I spent years just posting content about any of my face online because I was scared. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I started doing podcasts and did my own podcast, and first it was my voice, then it was my face. And a lot of people were like, "Oh, you should be careful having your face on podcasts. You know, it's quite unpopular." And then people were saying maybe I should like pixel out my face or disguise my voice like some sort of like criminal, like an actual criminal would. And
Yeah.
I'm like, then I just make myself look guilty. Like I literally look like a criminal. So it'd be like a
Yeah.
pixel face, and then like, hello, my name's George. And I'm like, that is just a great way of making myself look guilty. And I'm like, let me remind
Mm-hmm.
you, nothing I'm saying is wrong. Like, there's nothing to be apologized for, nothing to be guilty over. So no, I don't think I need to remind people that women and girls do matter to me, but I constantly find myself doing it anyway, and I try not to. But the thing about Richard, I've talked about it before,
Mm-hmm.
and he'll say something about like these issues are important because they make men better allies to women. So talking about male suicide helps men be better allies to women, and I'm like, that's probably true, Richard, but primarily this is about men and boys, and that's the main focus of conversation,
Mm-hmm.
not any secondary benefit to women and girls. And then he'll respond with, "Well, I'm trying to talk to women, so I'm trying to get women on side." To which I will always respond, I'm just like, That is so patronizing to women. You're saying you're suggesting that women would only care primarily if it's benefit to themselves." Whereas I have 15,000 plus women following me now, and I don't think any of them are following for their own benefit, as in, how can these issues benefit me? I think they follow because they have men in their lives that they care about and they want to see protected and supported. Like, that's why women care. I get messages every day from women being like, I have men in my life I didn't realize that they were going through. This really helps me raise awareness around what I don't know. Not a single woman has ever messaged me saying, "How can I benefit from this?" And I just fundamentally disagree with Richard Reeves's approach. Reevesism, I'm going to coin it right now.
There you go. There you
And
go.
it's just stop doing it, Richard. Please stop doing it. Like you're credible. You don't need to apologize anymore.
No, that's fine. And one of the because he highlights a number as you of these studies and these points that should that attention should be brought to, but
Mm.
he finds that porn and gaming for young men to be largely innocuous. And I was wondering, how do you contend with those issues? Because, quick commentary from myself is when he says like they're largely, innocuous and not harmful to boys and young men, it's like I see it as like, well, you're looking at the negative that they're bringing, but you're not comparing that to the potential upside that they're not bringing. That,
I don't think porn and
mhm,
gaming are natural bedfellows. I don't think that we can
mhm,
compare those two. Like I feel like gaming, I love gaming. Like it's one of the few opportunities I can have to spend time with my friends because they don't live in the
mhm,
same city. And having a headset on a bit like this is just that's how it is. That's how a lot of young people hang out
mhm,
and talk now. That's his modern life. And I feel like gaming is a really great way of men, especially spending time with other guys and their mates and chatting and catching up. And but porn, I think, is different. Like porn is not the same. Like you don't go around to your friends and all watch
yeah,
porn together.
yeah,
Or at least I don't. So I don't. I think that is something I'm a lot more cautious over. Gaming's fine. I mean, obviously, there's people that have an unhealthy relationship with gaming.
hmm
Mostly fine, but porn, I am apprehensive over. I think it is an addiction, and there's a lot of men that use porn as a coping mechanism for like loneliness and isolation. The fact that maybe they're not in a sexual relationship, maybe they're struggling with dating, and porn is a bit of a crutch. But I mean, in the context of porn, I would just say I don't know. I also don't know. I do feel like there's also a lot of. I think people overblow the damage of porn, but I do think it's serious. But like all addictions, like including like drug addictions, for example, I wouldn't ask why the addiction. I'd ask why the pain. Like why the pain? Like why do people take drugs? Like what are they going through? What are they experiencing? What are they medicating through drug use? And similarly, I'd be like, don't worry about it being porn. Just ask what is that man trying to help? Like what's he trying to solve? What's he going through or heal?
hmm
That porn he thinks is doing that for him. Porn is quite arbitrary beyond that, but I'd say what is he going through? What is the pain? Not the addiction. It's one of those things. I don't have a massively strong opinion of porn. I don't really know much about it. I realize it's very polarized. A lot of men are against it. A lot of men are obviously for it, but it's not the same as gaming. I know that much.
Very strongly on the gaming part,
Yeah,
but
put the
no,
phone down and pick up your Xbox controller and go play some games with the boys.
no, that's fair. I think the point that I was making with the two is, well, I think you highlight that your relationship with it is almost everything with a lot of things. So you can have a caffeine addiction that is extremely
Mm,
detrimental to your health. You could also have a caffeine, use caffeine and it could be extremely beneficial to your health.
mm,
So I,
exactly.
I think it's your relationship with it. But I think when I just hear game, like I find gaming, and I used to watch porn. I used to game a lot. I'm not equating the two, but what I found to be the similar factor between the two was these easier addictive elements to each of them. Like I would game for hours on end, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I just personally see things like, what else are you like? What's the upside? Like, what are you leaving on the table?
Mm,
But I don't mean I'm never someone who likes to, frown upon people who or shame people for, engaging in things. I'm more or less like, well, what are you leaving on the table instead?
mm,
And I think a lot of men, particularly as you see 9 million men in the US drop out of the workforce who are prime age working years, it's like they don't have encouragement. They don't have maybe any vision for themselves. They don't have much belief in themselves. I always say that parents are supposed to, or caregivers, when your child provide you that belief that you can do something before you realize you can.
mm,
And at one point you need to take it over. So I just think these are symptoms of maybe that problem of like, well, I can't maybe get that promotion, I can't have that dream job or
mm,
start that passion project or that entrepreneurial endeavor or have that girlfriend, therefore I'm just gonna pick up the controller or pick up the smartphone and watch porn instead. And there's
mm.
not too much, I would say, evidence behind it. I'm just using, I guess, my
No, yeah.
personal experience of like, hey, like you can do these things. And I find men maybe more in these areas because probably a lot of reasons, but as mentioned, I just don't think they believe they may not have much confidence in themselves to do something else. But as you mentioned, it could also be
Yeah.
a great mechanism for community and talking to people that you are not in close proximity to.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's
mhm,
like my mum always says everything in moderation, and she was a nutritionist. So I think the same for porn and gaming. Like, I think you can have a healthy relationship with either, but then in gaming, even gaming, for example, like if you're neglecting your interpersonal relationships and your partner or your friends in real life, or maybe you're not seeing your family, that's where it becomes a problem. If you have a family meal downstairs and you're upstairs playing computer games instead, that's when I would say worth considering, is this a problem?
mm,
But you're right. Like say, but there is that we have to, although both can be healthy, we also have to acknowledge that in gaming and especially porn, there's definitely a contingent of very isolated, unhappy, disenfranchised, lonely men that are using both those things in a way that can be unhealthy and probably isn't healthy. So all of these conversations require very like complicated, delineated, long form
mhm.
discussion that is both neither here nor there, and it's A and B at the same time, and very contextual. So that's why I like podcasts because it gives you a chance, unlike social media where you have to squeeze your entire opinion into one single tweet.
Hmm.
Here you have the ability to talk a bit more in depth and learn a little bit more. And ultimately, you're both right and wrong in every single set of circumstances, and it really depends on the individual you're talking about.
To address these health issues too, and more looking at solution orientated approach, how where do you fall between the line of equal opportunity and equal like outcome? For example, Reeves is in favor of having male only scholarships for certain areas where men are lacking, say, representation. Is that something that you find yourself with as well, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we're probably on the same page. I mean, fundamentally, I'm all about equal opportunity. Like, and it doesn't matter who benefits as a result, as long as everyone had an equal shot at success, then I'm happy with any sort of outcome, no matter even if that is mostly women or entirely women. But there are certain places where I think equal opportunity, which is fundamentally unfair, let's just say that, I feel like that unfairness as a consequence of the benefit is worth paying. So when I talk about the damage not having men in classrooms in for boys plays on that damages the development and success of boys. I think that problem is bigger than the problem of equal opportunity, so equal outcome. So I would say it's a price worth paying in that context. And within men in classrooms, I would be in favor of equal outcome because I feel like the benefits outweigh the costs. Although I do share people's dislike of equal outcome in that instance, and maybe a few others in relation to like psychology, I would be in favor. But in general, I'm not in favor of equal outcome unless we're talking about very specific instances like education and psychology. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't know Richard was felt the same. So that's good to know he's similar mindset, and I think it's fair enough.
Hmm.
But not long term, by the way. Like long term, I don't want any equal outcome. Like I don't want even like I wouldn't want any sort of affirmative action in classrooms either. Because once the problem's been solved, then I would want to drop all of his policies,
For sure. Yeah,
ideally.
I think like someone like affirmative action or that I like took issue with is like well a number of things, but one was just like who decides when it's enough or when it's
Mm,
done.
mm,
And I would appreciate saying like, yeah, well, this is temporary. And I think when it was ruled in US, the one of the justices that ruled in favor of this mentioned that this is not long term. Like this has to
mm,
sunset at a certain point. So it's
mm.
like who decides when is enough. And if there was ever a point when there was, more men in spaces like, all right, now do we do the same thing, just opposite? Like then do we make it so? And I
Yeah.
think to like the main crux of this issue too is like addressing like the root causes as well. If equal outcome, like if 2% in the US of kindergarten teachers are male. Like there's more, I heard this from Chris Williamson too, but there's more fire pilots, women fire pilots in the US than, which is at 4% female, than there are kindergarten teachers who are male. And
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, that's, shockingly low on the teacher side. So how how do you like, you know, gear that more towards men, and just thinking about it's like, well, what would make a man like want to do that, generally speaking. And I think part of like with the teacher thing, just overall, is that men are just looked at still to a large degree as, being provide like a financial provider in some regard. And even though that women want to earn money, obviously thrive in the workforce, they still would want a guy to do something similar. And teachers are just, fortunately, notoriously known as not like being the most well paid.
Mm,
So I think like the crux of that issue too is like the lack of, say, financial opportunity and stability you may have as a guy in that, where it's still looked at as expected, because men, generally speaking, I don't think expect women to be the financial provider. If she
yeah,
is,
yeah.
like, that could be great, but if not, it's not like a deal breaker. Whereas for men, like, there's definitely much more pressure on that, like, from paying for dates, paying for whatever, to be honest. So on a teacher's salary, that could be quite difficult, and that may just roll out altogether.
Yeah, I mean, even if it wasn't of benefit to men, I'd still be in favor of paying teachers more because I don't
Oh
know what it's
yeah.
like in
Hmm.
America, but in the UK, we pay them nowhere near enough. Like in places
Hmm.
like South Korea, being a teacher is you're seen as the same level as like an engineer, like very
Mm.
highly respected career, which it is. But in this country, we don't see it that way, and I feel like that is definitely one of the causes of men not wanting to be teachers.
Completely
But and
agree.
yeah, I mean that's a great. I mean that's a great policy where everyone will benefit.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, as you said, like the respect thing, men generally speaking, that you hear, like, want to be respected in their position, they want to
Mm,
feel that they matter. And if you kind of change the societal outlook on certain industries and certain fields, and raise teachers, as in my opinion, as they should be looked at as like this crucial part
mm,
of society on raising the next generation, that could also change the individual man's outlook on becoming a teacher as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah. I mean, my primary school,
Hmm.
6 years, we only had one male teacher, and he left straight away. He left after 1 year, and then it was back to
Hmm.
100% women. And I remember him the most. I remember like even though that was like 30 years ago, nearly. I'm like I still remember him, Mr. Hall, and he was the one I had the best connection with, and he was probably the best role model I had in school. And I'm like, we need more. We need more of those.
Hmm.
And I don't know why we're not getting enough. Partly the money, but I just don't think men are welcomed in school either. Uh, and there's like in the same way as we've had to like defeat the old boys club in industries such as like finance, for example, and engineering, where men have dominated and men have done some things to exclude women. That same thing is happening by women towards men in places like teaching, where it can be a very hostile environment towards men, like very kind of cliquey. It is a gold girls club. I mean, my brother-in-law was a teacher, and he also quit. And I wonder how much of that was because he didn't feel included or as included as he would have been if he was a woman.
Hmm. Yeah, I just think with a lot of things, people just in general, whether you're looking at history, wherever, like they look at a person or thing and like, do you think they're uniquely bad? Such as like men, as you mentioned, in the finance industry, doing things to exclude women. Like, do you think only men would do that, or men
Yeah,
uniquely bad? Like, why wouldn't, just
yeah.
naturally speaking, as we're humans, why wouldn't, and social creatures, why wouldn't women do that in some cases as well? Like that just,
Well,
it's
well,
like
it's just
almost intuitive. Like,
it's
hmm.
fundamentally, I think women can do anything a man can do. Like, I
Hmm.
don't, people are all for women's autonomy, but when it's autonomy in the way you describe, then they suddenly think that women can't do that. And it's like, they're human beings too. They're not saints. They're not perfect creatures. They're also just as flawed as men, just as biased as men are. In some ways, more biased, but at least as much as men. And
Hmm.
they're human beings. They're not perfect. And it's all important to say they're not doing it on purpose. I don't think the old boys clubs are necessarily doing it on purpose, but we fundamentally see the world through our own eyes, and people that see the world in a similar way are going to benefit to that. And like, it's not. It's just that's just how life is. Like I will always struggle to see the world as a woman because I'm not a woman, and a woman always struggle to see the world as a man because she's not a man. And that's obviously going to sort of feed into working environments that are dominated by either of those groups. And we've quite rightly talked about the men's groups in financing and engineering, physics, for example. But we never talked about psychology, teaching, and like the third sector, charitable sector, where it's the same thing but in the opposite way. And we certainly haven't talked about the consequences men and boys are paying as a result of that.
Yeah, Reeves labels them as the heal fields: health, education, administrative, and literature, which could be like journalist and things of that
Mm.
sort.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, health especially, like, especially
Mm.
because if you talk about treating, not even just psychology, but like how do we treat men? And like, there's not many men in health, uh, and there should be, yes, a heal, health, education, uh,
Administrative.
administration, literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I think he's changed it now to
He,
something else.
damn,
I, th-
I have to get caught up.
I think it's a, I think it's heed.
He,
It's,
oh,
I
healed.
think,
Heal
but I
sounds
mean,
better. I'm gonna
I
use.
think he's dropped administration and I think he's
Okay.
dropped literature, but he's kept. This I'm sick and tired of acronyms. This is where this get confusing. But healthcare and
Hmm.
education, I'd say the
But
big
yeah,
two.
for sure, for sure. Intuitive as well. Like you
Yeah,
just think of it.
because of the secondary benefits
Hmm.
to men seeking therapy and boys in education.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, starting to like close out here. What's if audience member listening here is this is their first time like, listening to the show or listening to a conversation of this sort? Like, was one thing you would want hit home with that individual person?
I would just say we need to stop seeing uh, men's issues as an internalized problem or a personal failing by that man and start seeing men's issues as a consequence of structural causes, just like women's issues. Like women's issues are not caused because they're toxic or they can't get their life in order. They're caused by structural external things around which they have very little control. But men's issues are often chalked up to internalized problems like toxic masculinity or personal failings where the man's just not good enough, not trying hard enough, too lazy, or even boys in school like he should work harder, maybe girls are just smarter, you know, and we need to stop that approach and start to see men with the same compassionate detail as women. Uh, it's always like in it, I always put it down to like a slogan where it's like if a woman has a problem, we ask, how can we change society? Which is correct.
Hmm.
But when a man has a problem, we say, how can that man change himself? And that's what I think needs to change most of all. Like this idea that men have control of everything and advantage in every single possible way is not true, and we need to let go of it.
Yeah, appreciate
So
that.
that's not too much to ask. That sounds like a good start.
And then finally, George, is there anything that you wish I asked you, but I didn't, that you would like to speak on? Any like topics that you hold near and dear?
Um, you've done a great job. You've asked me, I'd say everything, nothing I can think of, but I'm glad you asked a little bit more about the creative strategy and the philosophy of it rather than just the issues themselves. I think
Hmm.
that's a really interesting point because I think men and boys advocacy is sort of unique in the sense that it has two tier problem. The first is that are the issues themselves. So male victims of domestic violence, that's tier one. But the second tier and the unique tier is the fact that no one wants to talk about it. And if you try to talk about that problem, you'll get shouted down. So there's the problem and then there's the gatekeepers. So we've got to try and get past the gatekeepers to the problem. Uh, and I'm glad you asked about that because it's a very that's what makes it unique in my opinion, where there's so much animosity towards these issues that that has become a problem in and of itself. So that's what I find. But we talked about that, and it's very interesting. And I do like
Hmm.
Richard Reeves. He is great. Read his book.
Yeah, no, well,
He
yeah.
is great.
Mhm. Well, yeah, thank you again for all the time and thank you everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate this conversation and definitely follow. This is the last thing I like to do. George, where can people keep up at you at?
I mean, primarily on Instagram for now. I mean, LinkedIn and Facebook, but you can start on LinkedIn. Sorry, start on Instagram, and it's at the Tin Men, all one word. Uh, the Tinmen.
Yeah,
So yeah, see you there.
couldn't recommend that count enough. So yeah,
Thank you.
of course. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thanks,
And
Daniel.
of course, thanks everyone for tuning in. Take
Thanks for
care.
coming. Bye bye.